Hello and welcome back to ENC 1101. This week we're going to talk about narration. So let me get the PowerPoint. Here we go. So narration is a story that you're telling, whether it be fictional or real. It's how you tell the story. And this is what we're going to go over today. So first is the grammar. So we have quotation marks and direct and indirect quotations. The first thing is to go over an indirect quotation versus a direct quotation. So an indirect quotation is saying, you're basically saying what someone said to you, but not their exact words. So she said that I could go with you to the mall. It's not the exact word, so we use the word that as a way to denote that this is not the exact words, but the basic idea of what was said to us. If we want to use the exact words, that's when we do the direct quotation. She said, comma, capitalize the first word, you can go with your friend to the mall. In this case, we've said the exact words, so we use the quotation marks to show that we're using the exact words. And for a story dialogue, the period can go inside the quotation marks. We'll worry about putting it outside of the quotation marks when we get to research papers. Now, quotation marks have to have their introductory phrase. So the tagline can come before the quote or after. So you could do, she said, comma, you can go with your friend to the mall, or open quotes, you can go with your friend to the mall, comma, close quotes, she said. The quote does not have to have a tagline if it's obvious who is talking. If it's not clear, you need that tagline. So if you have two people talking with one another and it's clear based on the dialogue who is saying what, then you don't have to say he said, she said, or name of person said, or any other type of tagline. But you want to make sure that it's clear, because if we don't know who's talking, then the story gets confusing. And you can also mix it up with different verbs. So it's not always he said, she said. So he asked, she asked, he whispered, he yelled. There are different verbs that you can use to mix it up depending on how you're doing with the story. You want it to match the story. If someone is in a situation where they are whispering, you don't want to say he yelled unless he suddenly yelled after having whispered. So you want to make sure it matches the story and what's going on. There will always be a comma after the tagline and before the quote, or after the quote and before the tagline. So if you do the tagline first before the quote, you'll do she said, he yelled, she whispered, comma, start your quote, and capitalize that first word. The only time you will not capitalize the first word is if you have a split quotation. So if we have something like, open quote, you can go with your friend to the mall, comma, close quote, she said, then we're adding in the rest of the quote, but be back by 8 p.m. In this case, because we didn't actually end the sentence, we're continuing it, we don't have to capitalize the second part of the quote. But that would be if you're splitting the quotation. If you're not splitting the quotation, you're doing it fully like this, then you would still capitalize that first word. Okay, so going back to narration, the first thing you have to understand is the elements of a story. One of the first elements is the setting. So the setting helps us understand what time period this is going on, so we can understand the elements of the story a little bit better. And it helps us understand where is it going on, whether we need to know the physical location or just the geographical location. So with the time period, that's important because elements of your story might not make sense if we know the time period. If your story is modern day, then things like cell phones and other modern technologies will make sense. But if you're telling a story, like when my mom has told a story of driving through New York City, finding a payphone to call my dad because she was lost, and it wouldn't make as much sense if I hadn't prefaced it with saying that this was during the 90s. So it was a little bit different during that time period. They didn't have cell phones. So it makes more sense. Saying the physical location is like it doesn't take place in a room. What is the room like? So using those descriptive properties that we learned about last week. Also, the geographical location. If we know that it's winter, winter in Florida is much different than winter in New York. So we need to know where it's at so we can understand why are you going to the beach on a winter's day. It's because it's Florida, so you're able to go. You also have to think about characters. So who the characters are is going to be yourself as the main character. You're the narrator, and you're the main protagonist of the story, the main person who we follow in the story. But you also have other characters, and you want to make sure to describe them well enough so that way we understand how they relate to you as part of the story. So if your friend is part of the story, or your family member or someone else, how are they related to you is the first thing we want to describe. You don't want to just put me and Kelsey went to the mall. Well, who's Kelsey? Is Kelsey my sister, or is Kelsey a friend or a classmate, or who is Kelsey? So we want to give some amount of descriptive properties to make sure that we know who the characters are. Point of view is how we write the story. So first person point of view is usually how stories are written when they're talking about a real life situation. So it would be using words like I and me and mine and my and those pronouns. So because you're describing your particular experience. Now you can also write it in third person point of view and make yourself a character in the story instead of the narrator. So instead of saying I went to the store, I could always write the story Carol Ann went to the store. And then it makes more sense because I'm telling it in third person if I'm not the person who's actually being talked about, or just to give a different point of view of the story. And then we have our plot. So the plot is what actually happens during the story. So we want to make sure that we are giving the information, the setup to the story, and what happened in the story, because that's the main part of writing the story itself. So plot progression, you have a few different steps usually in plot progression. And this is a simple plot progression of one thing happening. So we have our beginning and our setup. So saying who our characters are, what our setting is, what's the background information that we need to know in order to understand the story of where we're at. Because obviously you're not going to start at the beginning of when I was born. You're going to start at the beginning of the particular action and short story that you want to talk about. The conflict is whatever thing that is going to cause difficulties for your main character. And it doesn't have to always be a bad thing. A conflict could be planning a wedding and how difficult it is to plan a wedding. It's something that is good, but it's still a conflict because it causes different things to happen for the main character, whether that be yourself or someone else when you're writing the story. The rising action is when we go from the conflict. So we've identified what the thing is that we're going to talk about. The rising action is how we go through the story. So we're telling the key characteristics of it. And then the climax is the turning point of the story. So if you are talking about, say, a story of when you graduated high school, and your conflict is that you're nervous to walk at graduation, and the rising conflict would be preparing for graduation during the day, getting there when it's finally your turn, going up there, having your name called, and the climax is now you're going to walk across the stage. Do you trip and fall like you fear, which is your conflict, or do you make it across the stage? So that turning point in the story allows us to see how the story is going to go. And then the falling action is how we finish up the story, we kind of wrap it up. It's not an automatic after the climax of I didn't trip, end of story. It would be I didn't trip, I made it across the stage, I went back to my seat, I was congratulated by my friends, and later by my family. And then the resolution is how does the story end? So talking about and wrapping up in your conclusion paragraph the end of the story of, and so I graduated high school, I didn't trip like I feared, and I was able to make it through graduation. So this is the basic idea. Now, a resolution in a longer story could be leading into the conflict that's about to begin. So using that same example of the graduation, maybe my resolution is I graduated high school and I'm ready to begin on my next journey. Now the next conflict is choosing a college or starting college. That could start a whole new plot progression line of where our resolution is our beginning setup to the new conflict. But for most cases, if you're telling a specific story of a specific event or something happening, you're going to have this basic plot progression line and not have too many plots going on, too many plot points. So in your pre-writing, you have to think about your purpose. Why are you telling your story? What is important about your story that we need to know? So thinking about Audre Lorde or Cherokee Paul McDonald, why are they telling the story? Why is your story important? Is it just because you want to tell the story, which is fine? Or is it because you want to teach something based upon your story? And you also want to think about who your audience is. Again, thinking about what words you would use to tell your story might be different that depending on who your audience is. If your audience is a bunch of small kids, you're going to use different words. You might leave out certain details that would be inappropriate for children. If you're telling the story to your mom, you might leave out a few things that you don't want her to know. It's not the best idea to lie by omitting, but we all do it. If you're telling your best friend something, you might include a little bit more detail. So you have to think about who your audience is. And in this case, our thesis, just like how our thesis in a description is our dominant impression, our narrative point is our thesis in this case. So this is where you say, this is the story I'm telling. Why am I telling the story? So a good thesis would be something like, this is the story of how I graduated high school and the fears that I had that did not come true, or something like that. So your thesis is going to be where you state, you don't have to say, I am telling this story. You just have to say the story of how I graduated high school, or how I got married or planned my wedding, or any of these types of, or how I had my first child. Any of these types of stories, you want to make sure your thesis identifies that story and identifies what reason you're giving for the story. Now, it doesn't have to be explicit. Obviously, Audre Lorde, when she does hers, she doesn't say, this is the story of my 4th of July trip that demonstrated racism. She gives us just the basic, this is the story of 4th of July, or it's implied in there of, she says, this is, one time I went to Washington, D.C. on a trip. That can count as her thesis of letting us know she's going to talk about a trip to Washington, D.C. The same thing in your essays coming up. When you do your narrative paragraphs, you're going to say something along the lines of, about one time I went to this place, or one place I would like to go to is this country. And then we know that you're going to talk about the process of traveling there, and this is how I would get there. So I could say, this one place I would really love to go is France, and this is how I would get there. And then I know that the purpose of the story is I'm telling about why I want to go to France and how I would go to France. And there's my purpose in there through that thesis, that narrative point. When we're drafting, we have to think about other types of details. So one thing is dramatic license. So you want to make sure with dramatic license that you're being true to the story. So what this means is, you may not remember what your best friend said to you, but you want to put a direct quotation. So instead of saying, she said that we should go, I might make up what was said. So that way I'm putting a direct quotation, but it's what would be likely said. I'm not going to use dramatic license to suddenly introduce a dinosaur to my story, because that's not realistic. Unless you're doing fantasy, sci-fi, fiction stuff, you want to make sure if you're doing real life stuff that you keep your dramatic license to a minimum, but use it in order to remember what was said, or to create dialogue, or to create details. For example, Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote stories about her childhood. She's not going to remember every detail of every story. She's not going to remember every single thing that happened, but she can remember the gist of what happened and be able to tell her story through, this is what happened, and maybe she makes up a few details just to keep the story flowing, and it's what likely would have happened. She just doesn't remember the exact details. You also want to make sure in a narration, compared to a description, so description, we want lots of details in order to be able to understand and really see what you're describing to us. But in a narration, we want to kind of limit those details, because if you have too many details, then it kind of stops the story. If I'd spend 5 paragraphs describing the room that I'm in or the place that I'm at, then I'm going to lose my audience, because they're going to be so sick of seeing descriptions about the room, they're going to skip that writing, and maybe they skip over something important just to get to the part of where the story continues moving on. So you want details, but you want to keep them to a minimum. So you want to describe a little bit about the characters. You want to describe a little bit about the room that you're in or the place that you're at, that the event is taking place at. But you want to keep those details to a minimum. And then you want to think about how you're going to order them. So you can order them chronologically, how the time happens, or you could add different parts to it. So chronologically would be saying this is what happened from point 1 through to point 2, exactly what happened, or generally what happened. With a flashback, you're saying, here is a story as it's going along on the line, but I get to a point where I have to explain something that happened before the beginning of the story. So if the beginning of the story is here and I've got to explain something over here, I could use a flashback and say, this reminds me of the time, and go on a short tangent to explain this so that we can understand why that memory suddenly popped up for us. A flash forward is the opposite. So we're going along with the story and we want to give a slight detail about what's going to happen in the story, so that way we can create interest of something that's going to happen. So saying, this is the story of the time I graduated high school and faced my fears. In this case, we know that facing your fears is that flash forward, that somehow in the story you're going to face your fears, but we don't get the whole amount. We don't understand the whole thing. It's just a teaser to get us to continue reading. So you can do that flash forward, and you want to make sure that you don't do that too much. You limit what you do so that you're telling the story and you're not going off on too many tangents forward in time or backwards in time. When we're revising, we want to make sure we're using time signals as transitions. So using first, second, I did this, then I did that, next I went to the store. You want to use those types of time signals to transition so we know that the story is moving forward and continuing. We also want to make sure that our point of view is consistent. So if you've decided to do your story in first person point of view, do you stay in first person point of view? Do you switch into third person point of view? That's not something we want to do. If you start your story in third person, do you stay in third person or do you switch to first person? You want it to be consistent throughout the story. You also want your verb tense to be consistent. So there are two tenses that we use in telling a story. We can either tell it in present tense, so saying, I am going to the store and I encounter a bat. In that case, I'm using present tense verbs, going to and encounter, in order to bring the people along my narration so that they can see what's going on at the same time as I'm experiencing it. I can also use past tense. So I went to the store and I encountered a bat. In this case, we're not experiencing it as the character is experiencing it, but we're getting the story across. So you want to make sure that when you decide which verb tense you're going to use, you stick to that verb tense, so that way you can make sure that you are doing what you're supposed to do. Active verbs versus passive verbs. You want to make sure you're using active verbs. So active verbs means that the subject of the sentence is doing the action of the sentence. So if I have zombies ate the girl, I have my subject zombies are doing the action of having eaten someone, and then I have my object. That is a better verb to use than a passive verb like the girl was eaten by zombies, because in this case the girl's not doing the action of the sentence, so it's not as interesting because we're not paying attention to the subject of the sentence. or we've created a subject who is not doing any action, it's just being done to her passively, and we want to show actively what's going on in these stories. But sometimes we can use passive verbs. So if you want to focus on the girl as the main character, then saying the girl was eaten by the zombies would be better for the story because the main character is the girl. If you're focusing on the zombies, then using the active zombies ate the girl would be a lot better. We also have this idea of narrative commentary. So obviously when we're telling a story that's already happened, whether we're telling it in present tense or we're telling it in past tense, it's already happened. So we have the benefit as the person now in the present time of knowing how that story ended, how that story, what resolution came from that story, from that conflict that we want to tell. So basically the idea is we know things now that we didn't know then. So we could write things into a story to say, well, I didn't know at the time, but this is what it was. But if you do that too much, then it kind of ruins the story because it ruins the flow and it ruins the suspense that you've tried to create. If you've tried to say, and this is the time that I faced my fears, then we know that you're going to talk about facing your fears. There's a suspense that is built up. If you say, well, I didn't actually need to fear that thing that I was going to do, well, now you've kind of ruined the suspense that you've created. So you want to keep narrative commentary to a minimum, but you can insert little points in there through narrative commentary of something like, I know now this is something that happened. But like I said, keep that to a minimum. So to give an example of something like this, if I were to tell a story of this car behind me, this is my husband's street rod. He's been building it for 12 years now, and he's built every piece himself from scratch and all out of recycled materials, all out of trash. So he didn't use a kit. He has no special knowledge. He teaches biology. He's not a mechanic, but he has created everything from scratch to create this street rod. And the first time that I met him, we ended up talking about the street rod, and I really wanted to see it. Now, I liked him. I had met him before. I kind of liked him. I had a crush on him. So I thought, well, if I talk to him about the car, it's something he's passionate about, then maybe I can get in to get to know him better. So he was happy that someone was interested in his car. He invites me over to take a ride in the street rod and look at the car in person. So I can tell the story in present tense. I go to his house. We start the car. Now, at the time, it didn't have a windshield. So something like that, I can put in narrative commentary of, by the way, it didn't have a windshield at the time. And we know, oh, that's a flash forward of something's important going to happen because I'm saying, by the way, there's no windshield. That's an important detail to the story to say, oh, something's going to happen. So we start the car, we drive around the block, and I start getting little droplets on me. And I'm looking up and it's a clear blue sky, so it can't be rain. So why am I suddenly feeling like there's rain on me? It's January in Florida. It shouldn't be raining. We make it back to the house, and now my glasses are completely covered with whatever this liquid is. And I've got it all on my shirt and on me. And we get out of the car, and he notices that I have this. So he goes to get a rag for me so I can clean my glasses. And then we start to smell what is actually on my glasses and on me. And it smells kind of sweet. So he realizes it's radiator fluid, that something happened. Now, I know now that it's radiator fluid. But if I told the story as, well, radiator fluid started coming up on me, then it kind of ruins the suspense of, well, what is happening? What's going on? Why does it seem like it's raining, but there's nothing raining? It ruins the, not just the suspense of the story that I build in my audience, but it also ruins the, if I'm trying to show how I experienced it, it kind of shows that I've kind of ruined the point of what was the suspense for me as the person experiencing it. So he apologized profusely. Now, see, I've gone into past tense. I need to stay into present tense. So he apologizes profusely. He helps me clean up and thinks she's never going to come back. Now, I didn't know that he was thinking that at the time, but I could put that in there of something based as a detail that I now know he was thinking at the time, she's never going to come back. And I did. And then he realized it wasn't about the car and that I liked him, and we started dating. But that's another story. But the key to the story is that I stay in present tense, that I keep narrative commentary to a minimum, I keep my verb tense the same, I keep my point of view the same, I keep using active verbs when I can, and I try to make sure. Now, there's many things I could do to revise that story and to make it better. Obviously, I'm telling it off the top of my head, not writing it down. So you want to make sure that in the revising stage, you make sure to keep all these in mind as you're going through. So, although you discussed the essays last week on the discussion board, I just want you to think about what is the narrative point in both Lord's story and Hugh's story, Langston Hughes' story. So with Lord, her narrative point, as many of you said, the idea is that she's telling this story in order to highlight her first experience with racism, and that even though they're celebrating the 4th of July, the freedom of this country, it didn't mean that everybody was free yet. So you want to think about the details with narration. She uses, in the middle of the story, she talks about the picnic that her mother puts together, and she describes it, but she doesn't describe every little detail. She puts enough details for us to understand. And then we think about the symbolism. So the symbolism of, it's the 4th of July, it's meant to represent freedom, and not everybody is free. That would be a type of symbolism. For Hughes, his narrative point was showing that his experience with converting to the religion of his aunt, the particular sect of Christianity, and waiting for God to talk to him and what he understood at the time. He shows us through the dialogue about the characters rather than telling us. So instead of telling us that the child who stays at the pew to the very end with him and then swears and decides to say and lie that, oh, well, I've seen God, I'm converted, I'm saved. Instead of telling us that that child is irreverent, that that child is not taking this seriously, he shows us through the dialogue that's happening. So you can tell us some things about your situation that's going on and give us details without having to stop and tell us everything. You can show us, just the same way of showing, not telling in description. He also uses an interesting metaphor of church as an ocean. So the waves of the people and the way that they're interacting with each other, think of it as the way the waves of the ocean go along. And you can see the metaphor, but it's not explicit. He doesn't say the church was like an ocean. He says, he chooses verbs like waves, and he uses descriptions that allow us to think of the ocean as we're doing this scene in a church. So that is it for narration, and we will be doing an essay on narration. So it's not a full essay, it will be narrative paragraphs. Let me bring up the assignment real quick. Okay, here is your assignment. So you're going to write a travel story or a narrative about a place you've either been to or would like to go to in another country. It has to be overseas. It can't be in the United States. It can be any country outside of the US. If you were born outside the US and you want to talk about the first time you came to the US, that's fine too. But it just has to be another country than the one that you're originating from. And you need to include details of where it is, what do you do there, and dialogue between at least 2 characters. So this checklist will help you make sure you have everything. You want at least minimum of 3 separate lines per person. Now, when you're doing dialogue for narration, after each person is finished with what they've said, separate it by a line. So I finished talking, finish the quote, enter, next person said, and that's how I would type it out. So you want to make sure that they're separated from each other so we know who's talking when and who's saying what. Make sure that it's in a logical, chronological order, including any flashbacks or flash forwards if appropriate. Use those time transitions, use details to describe what's going on without stopping the flow, and written either in all past tense or all present tense. And I want a clear narrative point. Why is this story important to write about? So why is going to France the place that you want to go to? Or why is having gone to Canada, why was that something significant to you? So think about those for your narrative points, and you will do that for your narrative assignment for this week. I'll see you all next week.